Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to those joining us here at Angelina College in Lufkin and those joining us online for today's event titled Why the November Ballot Matters for Texas Communities. I'm Matt Ewalt, the Texas Tribune's Director of Events and Live Journalism. Today's event will feature 3 panel conversations on the November election and what's at stake for Texas and Texans. Our first panel examines the significance of constitutional amendment elections and why they need to go to voters for approval, and we'll review the 14 ballot questions all Texas communities will vote on. Our second panel will focus on the implications of property tax cuts around the state. And our third and final panel, after lunch, will look at what the November election means for infrastructure investments in broadband, energy, and water. Before we begin today's program, I do want to acknowledge today's sponsors. Our major sponsors are Methodist Healthcare Ministries, Texas 2036, and the Texas Ag Council. This includes the Texas Forestry Association, Texas Corn Producers, Texas Agricultural Co-op Council, Texas Veterinary Medical Association, Texas Wheat Producers Board and Association, the Texas Electric Cooperatives, Texas Cotton Ginners Association, and the Texas Rural Water Association. We also want to acknowledge the support by the Texas Association of Midsized Schools. Foundation sponsors for today's program are the Meadows Foundation and TLL Temple Foundation. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event, they play no role in determining the content, speakers, or line of questioning. Just 2 weeks ago, the Texas Tribune Festival hosted 3 days of conversations on issues of impact to Texans, much like the ones we're having today. Select TribFest sessions have been made available and can be found alongside our newsroom's coverage, the news made at Festival. All this and more can be accessed at texastribune.org. We also thank those Texas Tribune members who are joining us in person and online today. Our journalism across all formats thrives thanks to the support of our members. Texans deserve the truth, and we're dedicated to delivering it. If you're not yet a member, please consider a contribution, no matter the amount, to empower our mission, and you can show your support by going to texastribune.org/donate and donating today. So about today's program. Our program runs through 1 p.m. with a short mid-morning break as well as 30 minutes for lunch. I realize as we gathered outside the hallway today that I'll need to play a role of getting everyone back in after the break so we can start on time for those joining online. Each conversation is going to last 45 minutes with 15 minutes for your questions. Now, for those online, please do note that these breaks between programs, and we'll have some slides up between our panels. There are microphones for our audience here at Angelina, and for those joining us around the state, you can ask your questions via our questions portal at texastribune.org/ask. And when you share your questions, please let us know where you're joining us from. Today's conversations are on issues that impact all of us across the state. Many of you have printed programs for today. I do just want to acknowledge 2 additional panelists who are not referenced on the print program but are joining us. John Diamond, Director of the Center for Public Finance at Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University, and Dr. Joshua Rhodes, Research Scientist at UT Austin. We are deeply grateful to Angelina College and staff for hosting today's event. Here to offer a quick welcome on behalf of the college is President Michael Simon.
Well, welcome to the campus of Angelina College. We couldn't be more happy to host the Texas Tribune as a member. I'm proud to have them here on the campus to talk about such important issues to our region and state. I also want to note that our mission at the college is to help individuals and communities reach their full potential. And the trustees and I and the faculty and staff agree that in order to have a community reach its full potential, you need informed and engaged citizens. And indeed, our trustees charge each of our graduates every year to become engaged citizens in East Texas and in the world. And so this aligns perfectly with our mission. We couldn't be more happy to have you here, and we look forward to the day. Thank you.
Thank you, President Simon, and again, thank you so much for the college, all staff who have supported this event. And lastly, before we start our first program of the day, and to share a bit about why today's conversations matter, I want to welcome Texas Tribune Editor-in-Chief Sewell Chan.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad and happy to be here in Lufkin this morning. The 2 years that I've served as editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, I've really tried to center the Texas part of our name and our mission. It's true that many of our reporters are based in Austin, but today, more than ever, we have journalists across the state of Texas, including in Lufkin, in Lubbock, in Odessa, and in many of Texas's largest cities. And we're not done. We're trying to get into the Rio Grande Valley. We know that areas like the Coastal Bend are important. When we go into these regions, our job is not to try to cover local news. We don't have enough resources. What we do is try to cover the regions of Texas, which, as you know, differ so much in terms of geography, economy, culture sometimes. And we try to look at the impact of policies made in Austin on these regions. What Austin is doing for you, and also what Austin's doing to you. There are sometimes different views on that. I'm very, very proud to work at this time of great mistrust and polarization for an organization that only produces news. We do not have an opinion section. We don't publish editorials. We don't take stances. The only team we play for is Texas. And what we produce is fact-based, verified information. So we're very, very happy to be here in Lufkin. I also want to give a particular thanks to Angelina College and to the president for hosting us as the first person in my family, the only person in my family to have gone to college and graduated. I recognize that 2-year community colleges, public colleges like this one, are the foundation of educational opportunity in America. So with that, I'd like to ask 2 of my colleagues to stand up. Pooja Salhotra, who's our Lufkin-based reporter. And her editor, Nick Garcia, our region's editor. Nick is based in Dallas, and he'll take over from here with the first panel.
Okay, they're on. They're hot. All right. We'll get a little cozy. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Garcia, and I am the region's editor at the Texas Tribune. Before we get started, I do want to quickly draw your attention to this little postcard that was at your desk this morning. This is a brand new newsletter product that the Tribune is launching today. This is a newsletter based off of the work me and my team, the region's team, are doing, telling the story of Texas from outside of its major cities. Every Thursday, we're going to be providing original reporting from cities like Lufkin, like Lubbock, like Odessa, and many, many, many more straight to your inbox every day at 11 a.m. We're also going to be rounding up all of the Texas Tribune stories from outside of Austin. We'll also be chronicling and aggregating content from news organizations throughout the state. In this first issue, we have a beautiful photo essay from the Beaumont Enterprise linked up about some stuff going on in the schools down there. We also have a story linked about a town in West Texas that is so cash-strapped they can't afford to pick up their trash anymore. So every Thursday, you're going to get a very great snapshot of what's happening in Texas, and I encourage you all to, if you have not already, signed up. And if you do, follow that QR code. Before 10 a.m., you will get the first edition that goes out at 11 o'clock today. We're very, very, very excited to be a part of this great state and telling the stories of Texas, about the people, places, and the policies that define it. So, With that said, let's get to the reason why you are all here. In just a few weeks, Texans will be asked to weigh in on a variety of issues, at least 14 constitutional amendments, not to mention any number of local issues, especially billions of dollars for public schools via bonds. Known as the constitutional election, this biannual poll occurs every November in odd numbers of years, following the work of state lawmakers in Austin. For reasons we'll discuss today, these elections rarely attract even a fraction of registered voters. Take, for example, the 2017 election. Fewer than 1 million Texans voted in that election, just 6% of voters. 2021 wasn't much better. Fewer than 1.5 million Texans voted, or 8.75%. And turnout here in Angelina County, voter turnout was actually below the statewide average at 7.32%. So, if the trend holds, fewer than 2 million Texans next month will have an outsized influence on matters such as property tax cuts, water infrastructure, and broadband, issues that matter across the state, but particularly here in East Texas. It is not a foregone conclusion that these issues will pass. In 1900, for example, Texans rejected creating irrigation districts in Archer, Baylor, Clay, Knox, and Wichita counties. Sorry, y'all. you can't do your irrigation. So very important matters. Joining me on stage to break this all down are three exceptional Texans. First, we have Ken Wink, Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Science and Professor of Public Administration at the University of Texas at Tyler. Second is State Representative Trent Ashby, who is representing a big chunk of East Texas, including Lufkin and Angelina County. And last but not least, in from Beaumont is Caitlin Bain. So again, we're gonna chat for about 45 minutes, and then we will take audience Q&A. That's question and answers, not statement and answers. Just throwing that out there. You've been warned. I've been told. Let's go ahead and start with Professor Wink. What the heck is a constitutional election?
Well, a constitutional election is one we're about to have. We typically have these in odd-numbered years. We will frequently have, I think we have 14 this year. That's not all that unusual. It's a little bit on the high side. I've had some years where we've had 20 to 25 on the ballot, believe it or not. And it's kind of the way we do business in Texas. I'm sure we'll get to the issue about voter turnout, but these tend to occur after the legislative session, which of course are in odd-numbered years, and so therefore the elections are held in typically in November of odd-numbered years, not during a general election. And so that is why the major reason we have relatively low turnout. But Texans get a chance to vote on their governing document. So.
And why do we do it this way? Not every state does it this way. A lot of Western states, I'm from Colorado, I'm a Colorado native, where, citizens can put issues on the ballot. We cannot do that here in Texas. There are other states where there are no ballot language questions. The legislature is just the alpha and the omega, and voters don't get a say at all on policy issues. So can you kind of demystify, if you know, how did the framers of the Texas Constitution end up with this sort of hybrid model where voters essentially get to vote up or down certain policies that the legislature wants them to weigh into?
Right. Well, I think history has a lot to do with it. If you go back and look, we don't have the oldest constitution in the country, but our Constitution does go back a long way to 1876. 1876, and so it's not actually the Reconstruction Constitution, but it was the next Constitution after that, and this goes back to the Civil War and Reconstruction. By the way, we're not the only one. Arkansas, Tennessee, and Maryland have constitutions that date back to approximately that same time frame, and so the framers of that Constitution were, as you can imagine, a little bit concerned about strong government control, so they created a constitution that really sort of restricted in many ways state government and local governments. And so what has happened is rather than call constitutional conventions to write new constitutions, as things have changed over time, we've gone through the Industrial Revolution, we've gone through the Information Revolution. So we live in Texas is actually urban now. I know people are shocked to find that out, that 80% of Texans live in urban areas. That's not the way we portray it. So how do you adapt to modern circumstances? And because we restrict government so much, in order to expand the ability to spend on this or to do this or to do that, we basically have to do it through a constitutional amendment. And so this is why we have the second longest constitution in the country. I suggest if we had to do it all over again, maybe today, we would have a shorter document, give the state legislature more ability to maneuver, but that's not the way it's played out over history in Texas.
Representative Ashby, would you like more room to maneuver? Well, that was a trick question that you don't have to answer. On that note, from the Texas Legislative Library, as of 2022, the Texas legislature has proposed a total of 700 amendments. Of these, 517 have been adopted, 180 have been defeated by Texas voters, and 3 amendments never made it to the ballot. Thus, the Texas Constitution has been amended 517 times since its adoption in 1876. So on this ballot, which you said it's one of the longer ones with 14, 2003 had 22. Based off of my research, one of the longer ones in recent history. We're talking about, we're asking voters across the state to weigh in on issues of limiting jury trials to 6 people in misdemeanor courts. We're talking about the permitting of financing of home equity loans with reverse mortgages. We're talking about, and these are some historical amendments, I apologize. The constitutional amendment to donate surplus firefighting equipment. Do these issues really belong in our Constitution? Is there some other way that we should be thinking of a state to do some of this stuff, or are our hands kind of tied here?
Right. Well, our hands are kind of tied, given the Constitution we have, I think, because, as you suggest, there are really 2 approaches to doing this. One is the federal government approach, to have a short document that's a living document, give the legislature leeway to pass laws, let the courts interpret when the legislature's gone too far. And so a good example from today or from this year would be, who cares if people in Galveston County decide to do away with the office of treasurer? Well, the simple fact of the matter is the Texas Constitution passed in 1876 establishes what county governments look like, what offices you have to have, how many commissioners you have. So Loving County has the same number of county commissioners as Harris County. You might ideally want to give a little bit more leeway for local jurisdictions to handle local affairs. It's a fair criticism, but I think it dates back to the original document that we're currently operating and living under.
So, Representative Ashby, moving down to you, again, 14 different types of questions, everything from the right to farming to raises for retired teachers via their retirement. Again, I think broadband and water infrastructure is very important out here in East Texas. When you're down at the Capitol and you're, in the bubble and you're looking at all of these issues that are coming to the forefront, do you stop and think about the totality, the entire picture of what will end up on the ballot? Or do you have to take these issues one at a time as a lawmaker? And what would you advise voters to be doing ahead of going to the ballot?
Well, great question. But first, let me just join in welcoming everybody here in person and online watching this event. I want to welcome the Tribune to my hometown, Lufkin. We're glad to have you here in East Texas. And, it's interesting in just the way that you frame your question, because the answer is, at least for one lawmaker, only myself, but when you're in the heat of the 140 days during the regular session, when these joint resolutions are being considered by the legislature, you really have no idea how many of the filed bills that are joint resolutions will have an opportunity to make it to the floor of the House or make it through the Senate and make it ultimately to the November ballot where we vote on it here. So as you stated, we have 14 coming up on November 7th of this year. The Texans are going to be provided an opportunity to weigh in and have their voice heard on. And the reality is as you're going through each and every day, you don't see a constitutional amendment come to the floor. And so for me, you weigh the merit of each and every individual proposal individually. And in my mind, I'm not keeping a tally of how many of these resolutions I have voted for. And I think it's important to note that the framers of our state constitution, they put a higher threshold on what it takes to get in front of you, fellow Texans, to vote on to amend our Constitution. And I'll give you the details on that. In the House, there's 150 House members, and the Constitution says that we have to have a minimum of 100 votes. And if you just look at the partisan makeup of the Texas House today, we have 85 Republicans, the balance being Democrats. In the Senate, the Constitution says we have to have 21 votes for a constitutional amendment to put it on the ballot. There's 19 Republicans, 12 Democrats. And so what that tells you is that from a partisan perspective, I think our framers had in mind that because we're amending the heart of Texas, our governing, our foundational document, our Constitution, that there needed to be a lot of discussion and dialogue and reaching some compromise, if you will, in terms of what those ballot initiatives might look like. So in order to get to 100 votes in the House, obviously it's not a partisan issue because there has to be bipartisan support to get to 100 votes. So, and that 100 vote is not members present. It is you have to have 100 votes, whether there's 140 lawmakers on the floor for that vote or whatever the number is. So, so it's very hard when you start out with an idea as a lawmaker and think, for example, broadband, something that's very personal to me and to many folks in rural Texas. You talked about water, Proposition 1, the right to farm. These are all wildly popular ideas in rural Texas, but it's a long road to get from an idea to help constituents in your district or your part of the state to getting it through the committee, getting it through in the House, the calendars committee, which sets the bills that actually make it to the floor, and then you've got to get a hard 100 votes, and then the process to start all over again with public comment and a committee in the Senate. It has to be voted out of committee, go through the Senate floor, and voted out of the entire body of the Senate. So it's a very arduous and time-consuming process. And if you look at just the timeline of when the constitutional amendments actually get through the entire process, it's usually at the very end of session just because of the difficulty of getting it through the legislative process. So, so no, to answer your question, that was a long-winded way, I apologize, of answering a really short question. But no, for me personally, I don't keep a tally in my mind as I'm voting on proposals that could be put in front of the voters, how many that might add up to on a specific ballot.
And so let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure votes that are going to be on the ballot, including water, broadband, and energy. One of the things that I had a hard time grappling with, just as a human being, not let alone an editor, was trying to figure out why do voters have to approve money for infrastructure. And I know that might be not the finer details you're actually asking to set up, trust funds for these projects. But we had a record a record surplus. The budget ended up being $323 billion, $144 billion in the general revenue. Why did it end up being that voters are going to have to vote on this stuff? Why couldn't it have been something else?
Great question, and I do get that question from constituents. Why are we having to vote on the expenditure of these funds per se versus just the legislature appropriating the money? And the answer is really, you hinted at it, for these type of expenditures that go beyond just the next biennium. or the next 2 years, which is all we can appropriate in terms of our general budget. You mentioned the $321 billion. Now, that's all funds. A lot of that is federal funding, but the $188 billion, that's general revenue from the state of Texas that funds our state for the next 2 years, which is we're one of only 4 states, I believe, that still don't meet every year, and yet we have the 8th largest economy in the world. So a lot goes into that 2-year budget document, which, since we're talking about the Constitution today, I would remind you, is the only bill that has to pass every 2 years is our state budget. Constitutionally, that's the only bill we have to pass when we go to Austin. But the answer to your question is because the Energy Fund, the Water Fund, and the Broadband Fund are funded, these are initiatives and projects that go well beyond just the next 2 years. We are creating in those Propositions 6, 7, and 8, specifically on your ballot in November, that deals with these 3 issues. We're creating a fund outside of the general treasury, still subject to the constitutional spending limit, but we're setting aside those funds so that we can put funding in there that is dedicated, and that's the key word, is dedicated only for that purpose. In the case of broadband, we're talking about $1.5 billion. Energy Fund, $5 billion. And the Water Fund is $1 billion. So that money has already been made available, but it's only going to be supplied for those purposes if the voters approve these propositions in November. If the voters vote down one or all of those 3 propositions, that funding will not be available for those purposes.
And so how do you make the case? So first of all, I think it's important to know that this is money that's already collected, right? Like these are not new taxes. But how do you convince folks in Dallas and Fort Worth and San Antonio who might have good water, they might have good infrastructure, their lights have so far stayed on, that we need these things for the rest of the state? How are you going to be making that case to the voters?
Well, here in East Texas, we like to use common sense. And I would tell you that common sense would dictate that you don't have to, there's no distinguishable difference between a person that lives in Dallas or a person that lives in Broadus, that they know what we went through this summer, that we have some work to do on having a viable and a secure electricity grid that is able to meet the consumer demands on electricity. We have some work to do on that front. And so when I think that voters, when they have an opportunity to vote for a fund that is going to allow the state of Texas to incentivize electricity generators to put more dispatchable energy onto our electric grid, I think that a lot of voters, that's going to resonate with, no matter where they live, because people know that's a problem that we face in the state of Texas. Water, same type of response. We have water challenges all across the state of Texas. We're not unique in East Texas in that we have an aging water supply infrastructure. That's in all 254 counties across the state. So I think the voters, yes, there's going to have to be some education and information provided to clarify what exactly we're doing. But again, I think people know that in order to keep safe, quality, potable drinking water coming out of their water faucets, that we're going to have to make sure that we have the funding in place so that these critical water supply entities can afford the infrastructure upgrades that are necessary. And I will tell you, and of course the Tribune has written about this, but in East Texas, where the state was settled, the first inhabitants came through East Texas. The infrastructure that we have here in East Texas in terms of water infrastructure is very antiquated. And in small rural communities, they don't have the tax base and in serving a largely elderly population on fixed income, to go in and just replace their water infrastructure. So this program that we're creating with Proposition 6, will allow communities, many of which I represent, and many all across the state of Texas, large and small, to have some opportunity for some state financial assistance, whether that be a loan, a low-interest loan, and in some cases, in the most impoverished communities, it could be a grant. That will be made available should the voters decide to put Prop 6 on the ballot.
I want to come back to these issues, but I want to bring Caitlin in to kind of broaden out the conversation. of the 14 constitutional amendments on the ballot, which ones interest you the most?
I'm glad that you didn't ask me to just run down the whole list. I was a little nervous.
Oh no, we don't have all day.
Aside from the vitally important ones we've already discussed, I really think the COLA potential increases for retired teachers are very important. Some of our retired teachers haven't received a COLA increase since 2001. That's wild. Our teachers are educating our kids, they're taking care of our kids. We need to take care of them. I guess that was an opinion, but that one's important.
Amen.
Thank you. And another interesting one, I think, is this El Paso vote. I know that it doesn't impact all of Texas, obviously, but there are only, and I just learned this when reading about this amendment, or reading about this proposition, there are only a few counties in Texas that allow their reclamation districts to issue bonds to pay for recreation systems. And El Paso is asking to be one of them. And so I think as we move forward in Texas, as we continue to see people come and see what we have in Texas, we'll see more counties doing that because they want to protect that open land, open area. So watching El Paso County as a model as we're moving forward, I think is fascinating.
What do you think the readers of the Beaumont Enterprise and your neighbors are thinking about ahead of the election? And not thinking of the election is an appropriate answer, or at least an okay answer. And how is the Enterprise going about trying to raise awareness about the election?
Absolutely. So I was taking a look at voter turnout. In our last constitutional election in Jefferson County specifically, 7%, less than 7% of voters turned out to vote, which is less than the state average. But 2 years prior to that, it was a little bit better, and we saw a lot of our local elections, the bond elections, we have a couple cities that still do city elections in this same time frame. So quite frankly, I think they're thinking about those, and this will just be an add-on. But when we can see those priorities converge and get more turnout on these statewide issues, just kind of jumping onto the local ones. And so that's really what we're trying to stress. Hey, we know you're turning out to see if your city council will have term limits. We know you're turning out for the bond issue because Orange County is growing. But here are these Texas ones that you'll be asked to as well, and we want you to be educated when you're voting.
Are there any additional local issues in your coverage region that are of maybe state interest?
Orange County is a county to watch. It recently approved an agreement for CP Chem to come in and create a generational investment in Orange County. We've seen Jefferson County be this home for oil and gas, but as we are moving to the future, what's next? Orange County is seeing a lot of that. And so we have some bond issues, we see some tax rate increases that are coming to try to accommodate for this future growth. And I think that is something to watch statewide because we all rely on oil and gas and plastics and what's coming out of our region.
Professor Wink, I want to bring you back into the conversation. We've hinted about low voter turnout. Texas historically has been a low voting state. Do you have any ideas of why that is and what could be done to change that?
Well, it's a big question about increasing turnout in general. I think in increasing turnout just in these kinds of elections, the obvious solution would be to put them on the ballot in general election years and even numbered years. I suspect it's the case in every state in the country that voter turnout is much higher in presidential election years than in other years. Then it goes down in midterm elections, and then in other sorts of local elections and constitutional amendment elections, it goes down quite dramatically, as you mentioned. And those numbers are not unusual across the state, the 5 to 10% of at least voting age population. So yeah, if we could find a way to do that, there may be some limitations on the constitutional language may suggest at the next appropriate time, which would be odd-numbered years. Bet we could change the Constitution to change that if we really wanted to.
I think we've changed the Constitution before in Texas. On that note, is there anything the legislature can be doing, should be doing in order to get turnout up?
That is a great question. I can only speak for my individual efforts. Just yesterday, I promoting on my social media, we went through and basically, well, let me back up. So one of the common complaints I hear from my constituents when it comes to voting on constitutional amendments, and I suspect there will be some amens and heads nodding here, is when you actually read the ballot language. It is so confusing. Amen. Amen. It is so confusing. And as a non-attorney, I have to remind myself before I remind my constituents that the ballot language is written by the Legislative Counsel's office for the legislature, which are all attorneys. And so one thing I would like to see is how we can go about making the ballot language more just straightforward, where the average Texan or the everyday Texan can just understand what we're actually proposing, because most of the questions I get deal with, Trent, what is this actually saying? What does this mean? And so what I have done, and I know I have some other colleagues that have done this, is I have gone down and basically done the analysis in terms of putting it into layman's language, what each of the 14 amendments would actually do. And so I put that on social media yesterday, and we'll be promoting that heavily between now and the beginning of, throughout November 7th, but starting certainly before early voting. So I think, it's partly up to, Secretary of State is in charge of our elections, and they have a limited amount they can spend in terms of trying to publicize the upcoming election, and I think they do a commendable job. But outside of that, it really is kind of up to individual lawmakers and people that are behind each individual proposition to really get the word out what they're trying to do or accomplish with that proposition. And I will say, we talked about Prop 6, 7, and 8, the kind of the infrastructure propositions. There have been an interest group created with a variety of stakeholders that support those initiatives to promote through the public and awareness campaigns what they're actually trying to accomplish. So it takes a team effort, but I think there's probably the majority of individual lawmakers that are doing their part to get the word out to their constituents. This is what we're voting on, and this is maybe, hopefully from a layman's perspective, this is what we're trying to accomplish.
So is that your first bill in 2025?
You know what? I would be happy to propose that deal to make it more simplified in terms of the language on the ballot. And actually, I think Professor Wink is right. He makes a good point and begs the question, in terms of having constitutional amendment elections, why is it that we've always historically had it in odd number years when, and outside of a presidential or a gubernatorial election year, and which would be in even years. And so I'm not sure if that would require a constitutional change or not, but I certainly think that that's something that should be looked at. Because I do think the turnout, I mean, again, if you're talking 6% on average of the voters actually turn out of the 30 million Texans that live in this state. Actually, there's only, I believe, 17.7 million registered voters in the state of Texas. But if only 6% or 7% of that is showing up to vote on our foundational document and something that's going to affect their lives, many of which are on a daily basis, then I think that we probably need to think about how we can be more inclusive in getting voters to participate in this process.
One thing I want to watch very closely this election is if the property tax question, which I think so many people are interested in, drives turnout. Have you and your colleagues had any conversations about seeing how that issue might impact the ballot? Or the turnout, rather?
I think it's going to certainly increase the turnout. Not everybody voted for the proposition that deals with tax cuts that's on the ballot, but it was my highest priority this session, property tax relief. And I'm very proud. I wish it hadn't taken us 2 special sessions to get to where we have the proposition on the ballot, but it's something that I talk about at every opportunity I get. Matter of fact, I believe I've spoken to 3 different audiences this week around my district where we've talked about this issue specifically, because I can tell you the people that I'm blessed to represent here in this area of East Texas, they're crying out for property tax relief. And the question I often get is, Trent, why does it require us to change the Constitution? Well, as many folks probably know, the homestead exemption that is part of this change is in the state constitution. And right now, today, it says that our homestead exemption is $40,000. And we just changed that 4 years ago to bring it from 25 to 40. Well, now voters have an opportunity to take that to $100,000, which is meaningful property tax relief by itself, right? But when you combine that with the approximately 10.7 or 11 cents per $100 that the state of Texas has says we're going to take sales tax dollars and buy down local school district maintenance and operation taxes, when you combine that together, on average, the average Texas homeowner is going to experience about between a $1,200 and $1,300 reduction in their property taxes next year. And the other thing that was, I think, very important is in our Constitution, we also have an additional homestead exemption for folks that are disabled and folks that are senior citizens. And so for them to get the additional $10,000 of homestead exemption, that also has to be part of the ballot initiative that we're voting on. And the last component of this is we've never had a cap on appraisal increases for non-homestead properties. So if you have a business, a rental unit, or whatever, there's never been a cap on how much that appraisal can increase. And so in order for us to do that, that has to be put in our Constitution, our state Constitution. And so that is an element of the property tax initiative that is going to be on the ballot. I think it's Proposition 4, if I'm correct. So that is a huge initiative, and I think that one by itself, because of the interest in property tax relief, I think that is going to drive what I hope will be a historic turnout for this next constitutional amendment election.
So one of the things I'm curious, Caitlin, is what are your local school districts saying about some of these questions? Because this is going to directly impact them. Have you done any reporting on this yet?
It's an adventure. The most interesting piece to me has been the smaller school districts that are really pushing their tax rate increases. Like, yes, you'll have to pay more property taxes, but if you do, the legislature will give us this much more. Sabine Pass ISD specifically will bring in, I think if their increase passes, something like $922,000 a year, but paired with what the increase that then comes from the legislature along with that, that's $3 million a year for a very small school district. And so they understand going to voters with a rate increase is challenging, but they're trying to push that extra piece. Like, if you do this little part, Texas is going to make up the rest.
Is that true? Representative Ashby?
Well, is this a bond election that they're having, or is this a...
Voter approval tax rate.
Oh, they're doing a voter approval tax rate. Yeah, those... the majority of school districts have not taken advantage of the local voter-approved tax ratification election, it's called. That is a very, that's a one-off, if you will. So while I forget which school district you...
Sabine Pass ISD.
Sabine Pass. So that's something that you rarely see happen. I believe of the 32 school districts I have, I think I only have 3 that have done that, and those have not been recent elections. So that is something that would be very rare. But again, I think the point that I would make is when you look at your property tax bill every year, the overwhelming majority of the property taxes you pay is your local school district maintenance and operation taxes. The state of Texas does not have a property tax. We don't collect property taxes. That is a locally driven tax that's collected for school districts, for community college districts, for hospital districts, fill in the blank. We can't control those other taxing districts. But the one thing the state can do to provide property tax relief outside of the homestead exemption that I talked about earlier is that we can take sales tax dollars, and you mentioned our historic surplus this year. We're taking $18 billion of that $33 billion, and we are directly buying down. We're taking, I think it's $12.7 billion of that. We're buying down the local school district M&O taxes. So essentially, we're taking state sales tax collection, and we're supplanting that with replacing that from the local property taxes. So I think the question really is, and this was some of the discussion for people that were opposed to the idea, was sales tax is not necessarily a predictable revenue indicator. But when you look at the state of Texas economy over the last decade, every year we've seen record increases in terms of sales tax collection. Now that, that may not continue forever, but I think the state of Texas is saying we're going to make a commitment that we're going to prioritize public education, and we're going to do that with our sales tax collection dollars. So I feel very confident, no matter what the future forecast for revenue looks like, that the state of Texas is going to honor its commitment should this proposition pass and that tax relief be provided.
Yeah, I was going to ask that was going to be my next question, which is, what sort of guarantees can you actually make to these school districts who could be taking on a very big risk, with forcing their rates down, and that money might not always be there. We've been through recessions before. Talk to me about what is Plan B?
Well, I think I hinted at it. I mean, Plan B is should we get into a scenario where we are facing revenue headwinds in the state of Texas, which, by the way, the comptroller just came out this week and said we have an additional $10 billion that we didn't anticipate in January that has come in primarily in the form of sales tax collection and increase in severance taxes, okay, which those two primarily drive the state revenue picture. So there is no over-the-hill look at a decline in state revenue in terms of those two revenue sources, at least in the near term, let's say 5-year projection. So while we can't commit beyond a 2-year budget, I can tell you there was a lot of discussion amongst the members about if we go to putting more of our sales tax dollars into funding public education, do we feel like that is something that we can predictably guarantee for our school districts? And the answer was resoundingly yes.
We're going to get to audience questions and answers here in a moment. We're going to have 2 mics here. You can start forming lines in about 7 to 12 minutes. Again, questions. Appreciate that. Let's talk about, we talked about Plan B for schools and property taxes, but what happens if we, as a state, decide to not invest in broadband, water, and energy? What do you think is, what happens next if those 3 questions go down? Representative.
Well, I think we run the risk of losing our Texas economic miracle. We like to poke our chest out and be boastful and proud about the fact that we're the #1 job-creating state in the country. And we should be. We should be proud of that fact. But as I remind people, that doesn't happen by accident. That took a lot of vision and foresight from people that came way before I sat in this chair as a representative. And so it's incumbent upon our current crop of lawmakers to make sure that we're doing all we can to continue the economic miracle that we have experienced in taxes over the last 20-plus years. And so part of that is just taking care of the basic infrastructure needs of the state of Texas. We have, it used to be when I first got elected, over 1,000 people of Texas were moving here legally a day. Well, now it's over 1,100. And those people don't bring a single inch of asphalt. They don't bring a single drop of water. And they don't bring a single, ray of broadband. And so I think that specifically on broadband, because I think people understand the critical nature of funding, having a reliable electricity grid in the state of Texas. I think people understand, obviously, you have to have water. It's one of the 3 sources of life. But when it comes to broadband, we live in a global world these days where high-speed internet is no longer a luxury. It is a necessity. Whether you want to see your doctor, whether you want to, just like here, continue your educational degree, whether that be in high school, which of course back in COVID we were thrust to an all virtual online learning environment where many schools in East Texas and around the state, especially in rural areas, they had no internet. They had no online opportunities. And so you have the education component, you have the healthcare component, you have businesses increasingly that are 100% online. And for me, my #1 job is to help create jobs in my part of the state. I want to be seen as a catalyst for doing what we can to create jobs in East Texas. And increasingly, just to fill out a job application, you have to do that online. Many of our jobs today are online. And so, again, I get back to this point where we have 24%, but let's just say 1 out of 4 Texans don't have access to broadband internet today. We have a responsibility to do something about that. And so we have stepped up last session and now this session and again, 150 vote in the Texas House, which you rarely see a vote that's 150 to nothing to create a state broadband development office. That happened last session. This session, with over 140 votes, we said, because this is, again, it's not just a rural issue. This is a statewide problem.
You're making a very great case for why folks should vote. But
I
what
hope
happens
so.
if they don't?
Yeah, so if they don't, I think we put in jeopardy.
But what do you do? Well, I understand the consequences, but what is the legislature's plan B? What do you do next as a lawmaker?
Well, we have to go back to the drawing table. I mean, I would say at this point right now, if Proposition 8 doesn't pass and we don't have access to that fund that is being created, then we don't get to take advantage of those dollars. And we have federal dollars that are coming down the state of Texas that require a 25% match. And the beauty of House Bill 9 was that the state of Texas, but largely driven by our controller who heads the Texas Broadband Development Office, he went on his statewide tour and said, there are many communities that cannot afford the high cost of broadband to match the 25%, which is what that funding is largely going to be used for. Now, thanks to the vision and foresight of Senator Robert Nichols, the senator for this area, he said, that's a great idea, but why don't we require providers that would be providing service to put some skin in the game? So for every individual bid to provide broadband, it's going to be looked at how much is a private provider willing to put into that project. So in many cases, the state's not going to step up and have to fund the full 25%. It could be much less depending on the project. But to answer your question, Nick, if we don't pass Prop 8 to expand broadband across the state of Texas, we will have taken a big step back, and we'll have to regroup next session and see what other options are on the table.
And I imagine that's the same for the other infrastructure questions as well.
It is.
Caitlin, what do you think, I think of cities like Beaumont, like Odessa, these cities that are big in any other state but small by Texas standards. They are industrial, they are rural, not necessarily as, let's use the word cosmopolitan as maybe Dallas or Houston, right? What are the needs there for this stuff like water infrastructure and broadband? And if I could throw just one more thing at you, because we haven't talked about it yet, the right to farm. Any sort of wrinkles there that we should be watching heading into the election?
Water infrastructure is huge, but I think one thing that we see in Beaumont, particularly we saw it in the past 2 years when kind of the last water infrastructure money was being handed out. Beaumont is far enough along in its water infrastructure planning that it doesn't get prioritized as much as the areas that don't have any planning yet, but it's not far enough along to be able to really go out and argue for things like the Houstons, the Dallases. We have this many people that are impacted. So I think we're a little bit stunted there. But ask anybody in Beaumont, the water infrastructure we need is protection from water more than water coming into us. But we saw it during this last drought, and we hear projections that this isn't the last time we're going to see a notable drought, that farmers in our area just couldn't buy hay or didn't have hay. They had to go out and buy hay. They had to go out and buy hay from other states and bring it in. And so whereas we might not have struggled with it in the past, I believe we'll see in coming years it's getting more challenging. So that's the water piece of it. We have more affordability issues with broadband than reach. Beaumont has a very high impoverished population. There is service, but can people afford it? Can people get to it? And so I hope that's part of the conversation moving forward, is not only how can we build out this infrastructure, which is obviously vitally important, particularly here, but how can we make sure that the lowest financial earners in our community also can afford it, so they can get the same benefits from further education, from being able to apply for better jobs that we're also looking at for people in more rural communities. The last one you asked about?
Right to farm.
Yes.
Number one.
Bowman is interesting in right to farm. Because there are some questions around that proposition, how that'll actually impact the smaller farmers. Will it just kind of protect big agribusiness that can use things like imminent danger and bring in their lawyers and explain how it's imminent danger, but the small farmers are actually hurt by it? So I don't know that we are as impacted as some other areas, but that is a question that I've heard our smaller farmers hope that taxpayers will consider.
So we're going to do questions and answers in 3 minutes. So if you are itching, I would start warming up to come down to the front row. But Professor Rink, one of the things that is a perpetual problem with government is, there are many, but the one is that it's always it always seems that we are, as in government, solving known problems. And I'm wondering, and it never seems to be enough, right? I mean, the money that we are earmarking for this stuff this year is a drop in the bucket. It's not going to be a panacea. I'm wondering, what sort of advice do you give voters and to elected officials thinking about how to get in front of problems? Is there a way that government can be doing a better job of getting in front of these problems so that we're not always having to play catch up?
Probably not. We don't know what we don't know. I think somebody said that once. But thinking about these infrastructure, we recognize there are problems, but those problems, as you said, are only going to grow. So in a way, we are getting out front. We recognize, same thing in Tyler. Our water supply is in pretty good shape, except for Dallas and Fort Worth municipalities are looking for water, and they're looking east. So it's a big concern in our business community. And I think Representative Schaefer and Senator Hughes are well aware of that as well. Broadband is an issue. I think Smith County's, I don't know the statistics, but I think my sense is that Smith County is in pretty good shape where Tyler is. But then, you know, I teach at a university where a lot of people are living more than 45 minutes away. So when you talk about Wood County and Upshur County and Rusk County and Cherokee County, now you're talking about the need for broadband. My wife works from home, by the way. She's got to have internet access or it doesn't work at all. So these are creeping problems, but I think if we can get some of these things passed, we will stay a little bit ahead of the game. And I think that's the idea.
All right, let's go ahead and get some audience questions. As we head on down, and I think, Matt, are you going to be asking audience questions from online? Fantastic. We do want to try and keep the questions to the topic of hand, the constitutional election. We know there's a lot of crazy things happening in the world right now, but if we could respect our panelists coming here to talk to us about the election and the infrastructure issues, we'd appreciate it keeping it to that topic, and you can grab them afterwards if you want to, you know, talk about the Dallas Cowboys or something. Sir.
Yes, Sid Roberts. Do you, Trent, this is a question for a friend. Do you anticipate that there will be future constitutional amendments required to fund these infrastructure programs, or is it more that with this current constitutional amendment, future funding is easier for you as a legislator?
Yeah, great question, Dr. Roberts. Thank you for asking. So the answer is actually pretty simple. So what we're doing with these propositions is really twofold. The legislature has put a figure, a dollar amount appropriation to each one of these funds, which we are creating in the Constitution. So these are what we call on the Appropriations Committee, constitutionally dedicated funding, okay? So the monies can't be spent for other purposes. So that's why we're creating these specific funds, the energy fund, the water fund, the broadband fund, for example. And then so once we create the fund, then it's up to the legislature, Dr. Roberts, to fund it. So there's the seed funding that coincides with the creation of those three funds specifically. And then to answer your question, the next regular legislative session in 2025, that future legislature will decide if more funds need to be appropriated into that dedicated fund.
So a reminder to those joining us online, you can also ask questions at texastribune.org/ask. We do have a few questions here from Greg in Georgetown. Will Proposition 1 have an impact on the use of eminent domain?
The answer is no. No, it will not affect eminent domain. That is specifically outlined in the proposition. But if I could, I have a little different take maybe than Caitlin here on Proposition 1. I was an original joint author of that bill, and that has ended up being Proposition 1. That is one of the top priorities for our agricultural production community. It has the support of all of the Ag Council, which is, I believe, a stakeholder group of over 50 different specific commodity organizations. In the last 2 weeks, I've hit 3 different Texas Farm Bureau annual banquets. It was their #1 priority during this session. So I have a different perspective maybe than folks down in the Beaumont area, because the people that are crying out the loudest and that are most vocally supporting Proposition 1 are the smaller producers. It's not the agribusiness, corporate farm types. And the reason why this is necessary is this is not a rural problem per se. What we're seeing, again, logically, if you think about it, as our urban cores, our suburban areas continue to grow further out into rural parts of the state, what we have seen in many cases are city ordinances, in some cases county, but it's usually municipal or city ordinances that are created by a city council where they don't understand the role of agriculture and the importance of feeding a growing population, not just in Texas, but the state, but the country. And so they are being forced to comply with regulations by local government that in many cases are putting them out of production. And so what we are saying, and we have a right to farm law, but it's not in the Constitution. So the reason why we're trying to put it in the Constitution is so that we are protecting timberland, farmland, ranch land, commodity production, not just the ones I'm talking about, but other commodities from this encroachment from oppressive regulation by cities. And so that's why we're putting the right to farm law into the state constitution, because that supersedes, obviously, what we can do during a legislative session, and certainly supersedes municipal ordinances.
Okay, I'm Keith Denby. I teach government here at Angelina College part-time. And I have a question that we got in a little late. You may have already touched on this, but do you think, as a panel, that the fact that our legislature only meets once every 2 years for 140 days creates some sort of distance from the perception of the voter that they should be involved with the legislature? And Mr. Ashby, we know how much people in Angelina County know that you particularly reach out to the public. But across the state, would the perception of the professionalism and the contact with the legislature be different if it was in session for more like other states or more like the United States legislature?
Yeah, I'll start with this, and then I would love to hear y'all's thoughts. Keith, thank you for that question and your kind comment. This is not an unusual question that I get. As our state has continued to grow, as I mentioned earlier, now we have the 8th largest economy in the world here in the state of Texas. Does it still make sense that we continue the framers' vision for a constitutional body, our state legislature, to meet every 2 years for 140 days? Does that still make sense? I would submit to you, I think it does. And I know that this is not going to be, this is something that there's great people can debate this and not agree on this issue. But for me, the beauty of our current system is what you just talked about, Mr. Denby, because I'm not hung up in a state capital, in this case 4 hours away from where I live. Every year, or for a longer period every other year, it gives me more opportunity to spend time with my constituents at the local grocery store, at the, you know, at my church, at my work, you know. And so, but I think the other thing you've got to think about, if we ever went to what would be considered a more full-time legislature, because right now the Constitution says we are part-time citizen legislators. We make $600 a month. So if we went to an every year type of arrangement where we were considered more full-time, then as a citizen, you have to ask yourself, well, then we probably need to think about compensation. You know, do we look at these as full-time jobs? And me personally, I don't want people running for the legislature as a source of income. I want people running for the legislature because they want to do what's right, because they're in it, because they're passionate about protecting their district, you know, advocating for their region, fighting for their causes. And I think the current system that we have, while not perfect, I do think that it provides for a lot more citizen input. I hear people all the time, yeah, I never see my congressman or whatever. Well, that's because they're always in Washington, D.C. And I don't always want to be in Austin, Texas. I want to be right here rubbing elbows with the people that are electing me so that I have a better feel for what's going on in their lives and actually tackle some of the challenges. You know, last thing I'm going to say, because I could go on. The last thing I'm going to say on this is people say, Trent, where'd you come up with this bill idea? Since I've been in the legislature, over 90% of the bills that I have filed, they don't come from me. They're not my ideas. They come from out here. They come from the people that I represent. And I think the more you take people away, their representatives away from the people and time away from the people, I think you lose touch with really the pulse of that community.
Really quick before we go to Matt, Professor Wink, is there any research that shows, and I don't know, that's why I'm asking, that legislatures that meet, you know, once a year can be more productive, or that their democracies are stronger? Or, yeah, I guess that would be my question. Are you aware of any research that?
Not really. There's more bills passed, but you know, whether that's good or bad is another thing.
I have a feeling this room would say no.
Yeah, I mean, I think all those points that were made were fair points. I generally agree with those. I guess it's intuitive. It's a slightly different question. I think it's intuitive to think that as society becomes more complex, urbanization grows in the state of Texas, population increases, we've got border issues, we've got this and that you would want a legislature that meets a little bit more regularly. But your question was a slightly different question than that, and I will say that this has been on the ballot in a constitutional amendment before to go to an annual legislative session, and voters voted it down.
Do you know when that was?
I'll try to find out for you. Yeah, I'll try to find out for you.
In the 70s?
I think it was in the 60s, but somewhere in that general time frame. And I don't want to be too flippant. I know we have to be careful, you know, about what we say, but I feel like when you look at the 50 states, they're not all the same. They're all different. For me, the question is, are people satisfied with their lives? Do they feel like their interaction with government is pretty good, and do they feel like they're well represented? If you can check those box offs, I'm fine with that. And so I don't get the sense that people in Texas think we're in any sort of crisis where we have to make major changes. Now, that may sound flippant, but I'm just saying. And also, think about this. If you were, you haven't, no one in this room has been dropped down from Mars, I don't think, in the last week or two. So would you really expect California to be like Texas or Minnesota to be like Mississippi? And I don't want to, I'm lecturing now, but, you know, this is the beautiful thing about federalism. We get to choose where we want to live based on the packages that we get from government. If you want higher taxes with more services, there are places for that. If you want lower taxes with lower levels of services and fewer bills passed, there are places for that. I think that's a great thing.
Going back to online questions, and again, we have another mic if anyone would like to come in. We have about 5 more minutes left.
Great.
So if you got a burning desire, Let's
Excellent.
get down there.
So we have one online question here. Will doing away with a county treasurer position concentrate too much power in county government, eliminating necessary checks and balances?
I think that's a you question, Professor Wink.
I don't know the answer to that. There's obviously something specific to that county that I don't have the backstory on. But the fact that you have to have a constitutional amendment across the entire state to get that minor change done, to me, is a check and balance. I'm generally more of an advocate of letting local governments have their way, actually. So I think that is a bit of a check and a balance. I don't know the backstory behind that county.
And I don't either. I did find something interesting that you may or may not know on this particular proposition, because this only affects Galveston County, and again, as was said earlier, because the Constitution creates the county treasurer position in all of 254 counties. To do away with one, we have to approve it. But my addition was this. So not only does that proposition have to pass on November 7th, but also it has to pass with a majority of support in Galveston County on the ballot. So even if statewide we would said with 60%, let's do away with it, but in Galveston County the vote was less than 50%, it won't take effect.
Caitlin.
I was just going to add a couple things. First, the current person who was in that office ran as a huge part of his platform to do away with the office, and he was voted in. Also, and might be a way to succeed. In the last time Texans decided on this was 1987, abolition of county treasurers in Gregg, Fayette, and Nueces counties, and then Andrews, Bee, Bear, Collin, El Paso, and Tarrant also don't have county treasurers. So I don't hear a lot out of those counties like there's too much power, or they're not using their money correctly, other than, you know, how we all think people aren't using money correctly. So as far as other places that have done that, they give an example.
This is why I invited Caitlin. She does way more research than I did. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Lindsay Anumala. I'm an academic advisor here. So I'm kind of on the ground looking at students who don't have broadband access. My question about that, I know earlier you spoke to the fact of, well, you know, we want them to have skin in the game. My issue would be, okay, they get a contract, they do put that skin in the game. If you could elaborate on that, as well as, will it turn into kind of a company store issue? Yeah, it's affordable broadband, but they don't upkeep, are there gonna be something in the process of getting this done that says, hey, if you're gonna make this affordable, if you're gonna get this contract, you do have to make it where it's actually working and you keep up with that. That would be my concern.
Yes, and thank you, Lindsay. That's a great question and great testimony. I mean, again, just pointing out the fact that there are so many folks in this part of the state that don't have access to broadband internet, that we've got to do something about it, in my opinion. But the short answer is the details on this particular program and how this money will be spent if it's approved in November will be developed by the Texas Broadband Development Office. So that staff and board, again led by the controller, they will actually vote on what the details of this program will look like. So we don't know that today. Now there will be a panelist coming up here in a little bit, Mr. Charlie Cano, who probably can speak much more in detail as far as what they're doing and what this might look like for his company. But again, I would just say in terms of the skin in the game that you referred to, again, every application for that project, okay, to bring broadband to that designated area, as I understand it today, that is going to be something that the BDO, as we call it, the Broadband Development, they're going to be looking at in terms of trying to incentivize the different providers that are out here today. And there's a lot of different broadband providers across the state of Texas. And so if several of those want to bring their service to Angelina County or East Texas, then there's going to be a competitive bid process. And so it's not just the bottom line, but it's also what else is in that bid. But there's going to be an incentive for them to put some of their dollars into this to have a better opportunity to receive that particular application or be awarded that application or that grant.
And we're going to go to our last question.
I'm Nancy Wyndham. I'm with the Texas Forest Country Partnership, 12 County, Deep East Texas, where Trent was our first administrator.
I used to work there.
Many years ago. My question is, in the interim year, if we ever get out of special sessions, whatever that is, Deep East Texas is very, very rural. We, not several, but most of the people in this room represent organizations for rural. This is rural Texas question. How in the interim and during the session can we all come together and have a more effective voice regarding rural and who we are? So I just feel like, we feel like that there's a lot of misunderstanding of, number one, what is rural? Who are we? And how do we play in the big picture? Because we can't just sit back and assume people in leadership or any of us in our areas understand that completely. It's time for us to make a difference and have a bigger voice, and how does that fit in the big picture? Multiple questions, but if we don't make a change now, it's going to continue to be the same over and over and over, and we've got to make a bigger stand for rural Texas.
Amen. First off, Nancy, thank you for your leadership on behalf of Rural East Texas and what your organization is doing and working with so many people in this room. A lot of different organizations in this room this morning, and I know our online viewers probably can't see them all, but that is a great question, and it's a question that really is answered by each of us individually and collectively. And we all have a role to play in this. We all have a role to play in this in terms of being an advocate for rural Texas. And I'm only talking about rural Texas because I'm going to stay with your question. So and again, there's people sitting in this audience that have heard me say this many times, but many times in an increasingly suburbanized state or an urbanized state where I think it's actually closer to 85% of the population of Texas does not live in quote unquote a rural county anymore, we have to tell our story. And when I'm talking to my colleagues in the Texas House, many times there's not opposition. It's just they don't understand. And you know this, we know this. We don't have to live in rural Texas. We choose to live here. And so many times it's not so much opposition to rural causes or the challenges that are unique to rural Texas in terms of the legislative process. It's just that people don't understand. They need information. They need us to advocate and tell our story. And so that's a big part of what I do. And when I am blessed to have a number of you come visit during session, I send you down the hallway because I'm with you. But we need to make sure that we're telling our story to those at no fault of their own, just don't understand the challenges that we've been talking about this morning that are unique to rural Texas. And so the answer is it's incumbent upon all of us. We have a role to play here to tell our story, but we do have to work together. And that's where I'm so grateful for so many of you for helping lead that cause.
All right, and with that, we'll wrap up this section. Let's thank the panelists again, Professor Wing and Representative Ashby and Caitlin Bain from the Beaumont Enterprise. And we'll take a quick break and be back with our next panel at 10:30. 10:30.